Anyway, when we got to Guam, I think that was on the 17th of February, and we flew our first mission on the 25th. And that happened to be a daylight mission, and the idea was to fly formation all the way up to the Japanese coast and back, or at least all the way up and over the target. I think there were 330 B-29s on that particular raid, and we each dropped 40 500-pound bomb, incendiary bombs. So I don't think that I could persuade anybody. Certainly wars don't solve anything. They're terrible things. I think anybody that's ever been involved in a war, killing is a messy thing. It's certainly not exhilarating, or it's nothing to pursue.
The generation of Americans which fought and won World War II was made up of the children of the Great Depression. As they reached high school and university age, they didn't imagine they would be further called on to meet the greatest challenge our liberty, indeed our national existence, has ever faced. During the years the United States was engaged in the war, 1941 to 1945, 16 million of them, more than 10% of the entire population of the country at that time, wore the uniform of the armed forces. Very few, if any, American families were untouched by the most devastating conflict in human history. The challenge was met. Then our young men and women returned home to foster a season of prosperity, progress, and peace, unmatched in history. 16 million came together in a common cause, but their individual journeys were unique. With each voice that goes silent, we lose another report, another singular interpretation of the events of World War II. According to U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs statistics, only 558,000 of the 16 million Americans who served in World War II were alive in 2017. Richard Donaldson, who flew 35 missions as pilot of a Boeing B-29 Superfortress, is one of them.
My name is Richard Donaldson. I was born on March 6, 1923. And I go to the Veterans Administration for my medical needs now, and in that place, you're almost known by your date of birth. And I frequently kind of mumble over the original date by saying 1823 just to check and see if the nurses are listening. Graduated from high school in 1941 and had matriculated at Carleton College and was there when Pearl Harbor occurred. Part of my duties there and working out my tuition was waiting on tables in the girls' dormitory. It was on a Sunday, and we had eaten our meal after we'd finished serving the girls, and from that point on, all of us knew that we were prime targets to be in the military because we were just the right age. I did not go into the military until the middle of my sophomore year, But I had talked to a cousin of mine who was a good friend of mine about what we would do in our military service, and we both agreed that we wanted to fly because at least most Air Force pilots could come back and have clean sheets in the bed that they slept in at night instead of sleeping in a muddy trench like the soldiers did in World War I. We had agreed we both wanted to go right away into the service, and we found out that at the age of 19, which we both were, we had to have our parents' consent in order to go into the service right immediately. And he got his parents to sign off, and I couldn't get mine. They didn't want me to go any sooner than I'd have to. He was called in January of 1943, and I was put in the Air Corps Reserve, which would have deferred me until my college class graduated in 1945. Well, in February of 43, they decided to call all the Air Force Reserve all over the country into the service. So I was called in February. So not having my parents' permission amounted to only about 5 or 6 weeks that I was delayed in going into the service. And I was inducted into the service down at Jefferson Barracks right out of St. Louis.
At Jefferson Barracks, Dick Donaldson entered the service in the oldest operating U.S. military installation west of the Mississippi River. It was built in 1826 and is used as a base for the Army and the Air National Guard to this day. Richard was not the first member of his family to go there.
And it turned out that was the same place my dad had been inducted in World War I. And I had a great-grandfather that was stationed right outside of Jefferson Barracks in the Civil War. But it was a horrible place to be. It was hot in the summer and cold in the winter. And this was in the spring, early spring of February of 43. And they put us in huts that were 16-foot square. There were 8 of us in each hut, and no insulation, no lining, and it was almost zero temperatures. And we had one stove in the middle, and they put a 5-gallon pail of water right next to it. And on normal mornings, that would be frozen solid. We all got colds, and we all wanted to get out of St. Louis, I remember.
But Richard Donaldson and his fellow recruits weren't going to be leaving St. Louis just yet. Like so many American institutions, colleges all across the country were incorporated into the war effort in those days. And one of them was Washington University in St. Louis.
And we all wanted to come back up in the upper Midwest where we'd been from to go to college. But instead of that, they loaded us on a truck that took us into Washington University in St. Louis. So I ended up with another 5 months in St. Louis that I wasn't looking forward to. We went to school there and at the university, and we had professors that were very good. We took mathematics from how to count from 1 to 10 up through spherical trig and all kinds of college classes.
Richard's class next would go to Santa Ana Army Air Base in Costa Mesa, California. It was an anomaly, a 1,300-acre air base with no hangars, planes, or runways. The first buildings were completed in May of 1942. It became a huge base for receiving air cadets from civilian life and giving them basic ground training prior to attending one of the contract primary aviation schools for flight training.
But anyway, we got out to Santa Ana, and there were 700 of us in the class. And there were, I think, 60,000 on the base. From the Santa Ana base, where we were determined, we took tests to see whether we should become a pilot, a navigator, or a bombardier. Everybody, of course, wanted to stay in the pilot training.
These men are aviation cadets. In the near future, they will have learned many things. How to pilot a plane, how to navigate, or how to operate a bomb site.
These are the fighting men of the United States Army Air Force.
Among the country's great accomplishments during World War II was the building and training of the greatest Air Force in the world. From the Air Corps of 1939, with 20,000 men and 2,400 planes, to the Army Air Forces of 1944, with almost 2.4 million personnel and 80,000 aircraft, it was a nearly miraculous expansion. One of the key components of the program was the primary training of thousands of enlisted pilots through civilian contract schools. One such contract school was operated by the Palo Alto, California School of Aviation at the King City Airport. It was the next stop for Richard Donaldson.
And King City had been a private flight training base. So when we got there, all of our instructors were civilians. And where we normally got paid $75 a month, which was the base pay for a cadet at that time, they gave us $275 at the head of a pay line, and we walked down and paid off for our room and our board and so forth, and ended up with $75. With the civilian instructors, it was so much easier than it would be with the military, which we found out when they moved us to basic training in Chico, California. Then we were back in the Army again.
At the 1,045-acre Chico, California airport, which the City Council leased to the War Department for $1 a year, cadets encountered the infamous BT-13, the Vultee vibrator.
When we got to basic, we flew that BT-13, which you also have up there. The Vultee vibrator, we called it. When you got into as you were approaching a stall and got just ready to stall out, it started to vibrate. And it would very easily fall into a spin. And it was very difficult to get out of a spin once they got in one. So more than one cadet over the years spun right into the ground, not being able to get it out of there. But fortunately, I didn't have that problem. Also in basic training is where we first did any night flying. And that just scared the dickens out of us. It was scary enough flying an airplane that you weren't familiar with, but then to fly it at night was doubly so.
In the months preceding World War II, the U.S. Army entered into the first of many lease agreements with the city of Stockton to construct and operate an Army training facility and airfield at Stockton Municipal Airport. It became known as the home of the Army Air Corps Advanced Flying School.
From then on, we went to advanced training down at Stockton, California. And that was with a twin-engine airplane. It was a Cessna 17. We called it the double-breasted Cub or the bamboo bomber, or all kinds of names. remember I had wanted to fly a twin-engine airplane, but I wanted a P-38, which was a fighter airplane, where you'd fly alone and much more maneuverable and so forth. The brass answered that by saying we are no longer in a defensive war. We're now in an offensive war, so we don't need fighter pilots anymore. We want very heavy bomber pilots. So we were relegated to flying bombers at that point. So when we graduated from advanced, I was assigned to go to B-24 training school at Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I think we were there for 9 weeks, long enough to learn how to spell Albuquerque anyway.
The Consolidated B-24 Liberator was an American heavy bomber designed by Consolidated Aircraft of San Diego. With nearly 19,000 built, over 8,000 by Ford Motor Company, it holds records as the world's most produced bomber, multi-engine aircraft, and American military aircraft in history. The Ford plant at Willow Run, Michigan famously built one of the bombers every hour.
So anyway, after finishing B-24 school, this was what they called a B-24 first pilot school. By then, under normal conditions, you would they'd assign a crew to you and you go overseas. But in my case, they were looking for pilots for B-29 training, so I was picked to go to that, and I fought the Battle of Kansas, which is where we were training at Great Bend, Kansas.
The Boeing B-29 Superfortress was another huge technological advancement brought about by the war effort. It was the single most expensive weapons project undertaken by the United States in World War II, exceeding the cost of the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb, by between $1 and $1.7 billion. The B-29 was the first airplane designed and built after the war began. Its innovations were jaw-dropping. Though it was huge, with a wingspan of over 141 feet, a length of 99 feet, and a height of nearly 3 stories, it was the first plane to be completely pressurized. Its 11-man crew was able to fly in comfort at altitudes above 30,000 feet without the bulky flying suits and individual oxygen tanks previously required. An analog computer-controlled system directed 4 remote machine gun turrets that could be operated by a single gunner and a fire control officer. A manned tail gun installation was semi-remote.
And they had an awful time shooting down a B-29 because we had this remote gunnery system. Because of the fact we were pressurized, we couldn't have guns projecting through a window like a B-17 or a B-24. So they had remote firing aiming systems remote from the actual guns. And we had twin 50 caliber guns on 4 different stations, 2 on top and 2 on the bottom, plus tail gunner had his own guns. There were sighting stations on either side of the waist and on top of the waist, and also up in the nose from the bombardier.
With 4 2,200 horsepower radial engines, the B-29 could fly more than 350 miles per hour for over 4,000 miles. Its speed and its 31,000-foot operating ceiling were its best defense. Japanese fighters could barely attain that altitude, and if they did, it could not match the speed. The Superfortress could deliver 20,000 pounds of bombs. We
went to Fremont, Nebraska, where they issued all of our overseas clothing and guns and so forth. And then we flew from there to Sacramento and stayed overnight and flew then to Hawaii. And that's when, on the flight to Hawaii, we opened our orders to find out where we were going and found out it was to Guam.
The island of Guam was a symbol of the ebb and flow of the Pacific theater of World War II. A United States possession since its capture from Spain in 1898, it was captured by the Japanese in December of 1941, just 3 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor. In a horrendous battle to retake the island in July and August of 1944, 1,777 Americans were killed and 5,798 were wounded. 18,337 Japanese were killed. And when the battle ended, the U.S. and its allies had the B-29 bomber base they sought in order to launch strikes against the Japanese home islands. The 19th Bombardment Group was activated at Great Bend Army Airfield in Kansas on April 4, 1944. It was ordered to Guam on the 16th of January 1945. On Guam, the 19th was assigned to the 314th Bomber Wing of the 20th Air Force's 21st Bomber Command.
Anyway, when we got to Guam, I think that was on the 17th of February, and we flew our first mission on the 25th. And that happened to be a daylight mission, and the idea was to fly formation all the way up to the Japanese coast and back, or at least all the way up and over the target. And we found out right away that the weather always changes. There's always at least one front between Guam and Japan, and that's where the two air masses meet, and you get a lot of bad weather, rain, and we were flying formation at relatively low altitude, I think about 2,000 feet or so, and we ran into that first front, and right away you couldn't see the airplane on either side of him. So we had to fly in the blind all the rest of the way up to Japan and finally climb up to our bombing altitude, which was happened to be 28,000 feet, where we broke out between two cloud masses. And we'd always heard that the Japanese were not nearly as good with anti-aircraft as the Germans were. And the first burst of anti-aircraft fire that I saw was right square in front of our nose. And the next one was one off either wing and one off the tail, and I thought, well, these guys are pretty good. But fortunately, they never fired the next one because they didn't hit us anyway. We dropped our bombs by radar. And it was really a kind of a mess. There were airplanes all over the place. And we discovered the jet stream. I think no one had ever heard of the jet stream before that. And that's a very strong current of air that comes off the Asian mainland. And they'd clocked it up to as high as 225 miles an hour. And we found out that if we were going downwind with that, we were going so fast that we couldn't crank in the bomb sight in order to bomb. And if we were going upwind, we almost were standing still. So it was a big factor in the fact that we had to end up bombing from much lower altitudes than we were originally intended to bomb from. So we had a general in charge of us that had been in the 8th Air Force out of England and had witnessed the English bombing incendiaries at night. So he decided that our best bet was to use incendiary bombs and bomb from lower altitudes, which would be all the way from 5,000 to about 10,000 feet. We were appalled by the idea of doing that because we felt we were well within the range of any gun that the Japanese would have had, maybe even their shotguns at that altitude. and well within the range of their fighters and so forth. On the 9th of March, we flew our first incendiary raid against Tokyo, and I think there were 330 B-29s on that particular raid. And we each dropped 40 500-pound bomb, incendiary bombs. These bombs were composed of 28 sticks. They were about 3 feet long, and they had a detonator on either end, and it was filled with napalm. When you dropped the 500-pound cluster, that was set to explode at about 2,000 feet. And then from that, the individual sticks spread out. And whenever they hit, they would hit one end or the other, and that would explode that stick. And that napalm, which is a jellied gas, would fly any place and stick to whatever. And it burned at such a high temperature, it would melt almost any steel structure or machinery or anything. So, and of course, the Japanese buildings were almost all built out of wood, so it was very effective against them. We knew that, I think in that first raid, we bombed out about 16 square miles of the city of Tokyo. And the estimate was it was about 100,000 civilians were killed. We were very concerned about that. Not as much as I am now, I guess, because we were full of the desire to beat and kill Japanese people. But we were aware of the fact that we were a signatory to the Geneva Conventions, which stipulated that you should not target civilians. And here we were targeting civilians. And we found out later, that almost everybody did that.
World War II brought the first widespread use of strategic bombing against cities and their civilian populations. During the lead-up to the war, in 1937, the Japanese were among the first to do it. Its Imperial Air Force conducted widespread civilian bombing during its attempt to subjugate China.
I know I have feelings almost every day about the fact that did much damage to 67 cities in Japan during the time that I was there, and killed more civilians than all the military losses Japan suffered in the entire war. The B-29s had also dropped, mines in the harbors to where they couldn't supply themselves with shipping even. So they were almost starving to death. And we found out later many of the Japanese military wanted to prevail and continue the war, feeling that if they made the landings which we felt would be necessary, if they made those difficult enough, they could get a better settlement, and the terms of their peace would be much better. As I don't think they could have gotten much better than their terms were. But anyway, that was a big problem in Japan, trying to decide what to do, because I think they knew that they were defeated. Okay, this is a picture of our airplane and the entire crew. This is Hans Gamble, Harry Peter Neil Gamble III.
Dick Donaldson went on to fly 35 missions to Japan in the B-29. He seems as connected to his airplane and the crew he flew with, he's the last surviving crew member, as he was the day he left Guam.
I flew my 35th mission on the 1st of August, and on the 6th of August they dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, and I was on my way home at that point. I was en route between Guam and Inuitak, I think it was, on flying ATC.
Dick started home from the theater as he had arrived, by air. He and his Navigator were first flown to Hawaii by the Air Transport Command.
And we finally got, the Navigator and I got back to Hawaii on the way home. And there they took us off the Air Transport Command because they wanted to save the ATC planes to fly prisoners of war that would be released when they knew that the signing of the peace treaty was imminent, and they wanted to be able to get those people and fly them back as quickly as they could. So we were left there without any way to get back to the States. And there was a troop ship coming all the way from the Philippines. They didn't want to stop long enough in Hawaii to put on stores, but we did. We were able to get aboard. And because of the fact that they didn't take on more supplies, we had to go on a rationing of 2 meals a day. Anyway, finally, I think it took us, we flew overseas from Sacramento to Hawaii in 10 hours, and it took us 12 days to get back by ship. And the skipper of the ship didn't believe, he was worried that there would be Japanese submarines around that didn't know about the peace treaty yet, so he zigzagged all the way back, and that's what took us so long.
After 12 days, the ship got back to harbor in San Francisco just after 10 p.m. when the harbor had closed. The ship had to be inspected, and the inspector was not willing to come out until morning. Since the troops had already cleaned the ship, the captain would not let them go below decks for the night.
And at 7 o'clock in the morning, we were the first troop ship back after the end of the war, and they had a tugboat come out from shore with a whole bunch of girls and a band and welcome home, you know. Here we'd been standing on the deck of that ship all night long, you know. We weren't too happy about being welcomed home in that way, but anyway, it was quite an experience. And that was the end of the war for me.
In some ways, it's fair to ask if the war ever ends for the ones who have to fight it. Carl Melantes, who was awarded the Navy Cross for Valor, wrote, "When the peace treaty is signed, the war isn't over for veterans or the family. It's just starting." Certainly, there are the memories.
We were assigned to go down to Cuba for a week's overwater navigation training over the Gulf of Mexico. And we were short of B-29, so we were assigned to B-17 to fly down there. Anyway, we were flying out over the Gulf of Mexico at night, and we got an engine fire on our number 4 engine. And we did just about everything we could to put out that fire. Anyway, we were just getting ready to bail out over the Gulf at night when the fire burned the bolts that mounted it on the wing, and it fell off into the ocean or into the Gulf of Mexico. So we just flew the airplane back and landed under normal conditions. We were very fortunate there. And one night we took off. There had been thunderstorms in the area that night. Right after we left the ground, we were kind of in the clouds. And the first thing I noticed was our bombardier, who sat right in front of us, said, "What the?" And all of a sudden, our landing lights were retracting, and we hit some trees. And it was right at the edge of the cliff. And so we went over the cliff, and we had I think we bent up about 4 feet to the right wingtip, and we had every prop had at least one blade that had coral necks in it. So here we were off that cliff and in the dark, and we had 500 feet and we'd be in the ocean, and we were in a turn to the right because of that bent right wingtip. So right away I had to toggle the bomb switch, or a switch that released the bombs into the ocean, and that gave us enough lift to where we came back and missed the cliff on the way back. And we landed at another field because there were airplanes still taking off from ours. They ended up, I had to sign a statement of charges for the airplane commander, and I had to sign for a $600,000 airplane.
There are the memories, and there are the feelings.
Well, as I mentioned before, I was very concerned about the targeting of civilians. But anyway, I find that, everything that has happened in warfare since World War II Civilians are almost the only target. So I don't think, it's something that's out of our control now. Okay, after I was discharged, I went back and finished my college education. I met a girl there that I married, and came back here and started in the lumber business. My grandfather and my great-grandfather had started the coal business in Tracy in 1894. And my dad had bought out my great-grandfather, I think in 1936. Some of the experiences I'd had in various places, I had originally intended to graduate from Carleton College with an econ degree and go to Harvard and get a master's in business administration and take on New York City. But I had decided that the life in the bigger cities didn't appeal to me as much as the smaller towns. So I had written my dad that I was thinking of coming back to Tracy, and that since we had that lumberyard physically, the plant there, I might start a lumber business to go along with the coal business, because that was kind of phasing out anyway. So that's what we did. During the time that we were starting that and running it, I raised 3 children and sent them all to college and graduate school. And then at the age of 60, my oldest son came back and was going to take over the family business. So I was casting around for something to do, and my wife and I decided to join the Peace Corps. And we spent 4 years, 2 years in Jamaica and 2 years in Barbados. I learned that the best way for happiness is to feel that you're helping people. And when you're in the Peace Corps and working with people that are having problems in third world countries, you think you're helping them. Whether you actually are or not, I guess doesn't really make any difference as long as you think so. So to me, it was a very satisfying experience. It was a life-altering type of experience. Certainly, wars don't solve anything. They're terrible things. I think anybody that's ever been involved in a war would decry anybody else getting involved in one. Killing is a messy thing. It's certainly not exhilarating, or it's nothing to pursue.
Air power ended the Pacific War in a way beyond the imagination of any of the visionary pre-war strategists. None of the Japanese or American planning have been conducted with any idea of the two weapons which would bring the war so completely and so suddenly to an end: the Boeing Superfortress and the atomic bomb. Conventional air power had gone a long way toward defeating the Japanese, but they were determined to resist an invasion with every weapon at their disposal. The Japanese were a homogeneous nation, 100 million strong. They were willing to die for their country and for their emperor. The Boeing B-29 was the most expensive single project of World War II. It cost more than $3 billion for design, development, production, and deployment. The Manhattan Project, which resulted in the atomic bomb, cost $2 billion. The B-29 was clearly the most outstanding bomber in the war by any standards of performance. It was far ahead of the American B-17 and the British Lancaster. The Superfortress was the joint project of a few visionary American corps planners. They were aided by General Hap Arnold, who pushed the program through the spite of many hazards. The other important factor was the engineering strength and heavy bomber experience of the Boeing Aircraft Corporation. By 1940, it seemed possible that England would be invaded and occupied. That meant that Nazi Germany would have to be bombed by US bases. The Air Corps called for a speed of 400 miles an hour, a range of 5,333 miles, and a 2,000-pound bomb load. It was an audacious gamble of the part of the Air Corps and of the Boeing Company. Boeing was perhaps taking the greater chance. The Air Corps could hedge its bets with other manufacturers for less ambitious airplanes. But Boeing had to rely not only on its own capability, it also had to trust its vendors. Many of them were being asked to create components fully as advanced as the aircraft itself. Shortcuts had to be taken. Each one added to an already ambitious program. Dollars were freely available, but they were not always a solution. The handsome, streamlined airframe was a radical departure from all previous Boeing practice. It involved new metals and new fabrication techniques. Boeing's entire production capacity was occupied with building the B-17. For the B-29, it was necessary to build entire new plants, and there was a greater challenge: the creation of a new, highly skilled workforce. Vast schools were established on the factory sites, with 90 days of training or less. Farmers, housewives, and young people just out of high school were taught how to do everything necessary to build the most complex aircraft in history. By 1943, Boeing had 58,000 employees building the B-29. Boeing knew from the start that its greatest question mark was the unproven engine. The R-3350 needed several years more development than was available. It would go into the field unready. It would be a constant nightmare to mechanics and a worry to pilots taking off with too heavy loads from too short runways. Even with the R-3350's power, the speed and range requirements were too difficult to attain. They could only be achieved by combining a highly streamlined design with a wing using a new Boeing high-lift airfoil and sophisticated flap system. The USAAF thought Boeing's approach was too radical. They thought the wing loading was too high, and that its pilots wouldn't be able to handle the airplane. They cited the experience of the notorious Martin B-26 as an example. Boeing analyzed the B-26 and found that it had a low aspect ratio wing mounted on the fuselage in a way that induced drag. They explained that the B-26 problem stemmed out from bad design. They said that the B-29's excellent design would avoid difficulties. To achieve the necessary performance, the B-29 had to operate at high altitudes. For this, pressurization of the fuselage was mandatory. Boeing had experimented with pressurization in the Model 307 Stratoliner passenger plane, but no production bomber had ever been pressurized. The B-29 adopted a new three-bubble system. The pilot, co-pilot, engineer, radio operator, and navigator were up in the front pod. The gunners were positioned in the mid-fuselage pressurized area and connected to the cockpit by a tunnel spanning the twin bomb bays. The tail gunner was crammed into a third pressurized compartment in the rear, isolated and very much alone. Because of the pressurization system, standard gun turrets could not be used. The armament had to be remotely operated. A general electric fire control system had to be created. It used an early computer that compensated for speed, range, altitude, wind temperature, and trajectory. The results were remarkably good. Any gunner apart from the tail gunner could control more than one station. The computers permitted firing at targets beyond the range of conventional hand-operated guns. The demand for the Boeing B-29 increased. Rival firms Bell Aircraft and Glenn O'Martin were tasked to build it. Boeing felt it was being asked to train competition for the post-war marketplace. By the time the XB-29 made its first flight on September 21, 1942, the USAAF had placed a mammoth order for 1,664 of the aircraft. But the first two prototypes caught fire in the air. The second one crashed into a meat packing plant. The entire crew was killed. In spite of all the difficulties, the first B-29 of the 58th Bombardment Wing landed at Kharagpur, India on April 24, 1944 to begin Operation Matterhorn. Operation Matterhorn was designed to knock out the Japanese steel industry. The idea of B-29 bombing Japan from Chinese bases was attractive in political terms. President Roosevelt had promised Chiang Kai-shek to begin bombing operations against Japan by November 1944. But in practice, it was flawed for a wide variety of economic, logistic, and command reasons. Chiang Kai-shek's subordinates refused to get serious about building air bases until enough money had been paid to permit embezzlement on a massive scale. Army General Vinegar Joe Stilwell estimated that at least half of the $100 million in gold required by the Chinese was siphoned off to corrupt officials. The air bases themselves were a monument to the patience and industry of the Chinese people. They literally built them by hand, without power equipment of any sort. They used the most primitive tools to move earth or chip stones. The operation was based on the assumption that the B-29s would support their own operations by flying gasoline over the hump, the high mountain passes in the Himalayas separating India and China. The B-29s would be supported by a fleet of B-24s serving as tankers. But the B-29 was a brand new weapon that had not yet received sufficient testing. It would be bad practice to subject it to continuous flights over the mountains. Then, there was the primitive maintenance and the continuing shortage of parts and labor. But the task had to be done. There was no alternative. The complexity of the logistics was a function of the sheer size of the B-29 units. The Superfortress had a crew of 7. 7 aircraft were assigned per squadron, and there were 28 per group, and a grand total of 112 for the wing. Each B-29 was assigned 2 crews. A fully manned wing had a total personnel of 11,112. When all its elements arrived overseas, 20th Bomber Command had more than 20,000 officers and men plucked down in brand new bases in India and China, eager to go to war. Lieutenant General George Stratomayor was made responsible for the 20th Bomber Command's administration and logistics. General Claire Chennault was responsible for the fighter defense and complete ground support of the B-29 bases in China. The B-29's very first combat raid was mounted on June 5, 1944. General Wolfe led 98 aircraft against the railroad marshalling yards in Bangkok, Thailand. Five aircraft crashed en route, 42 had to make emergency landings. Later reconnaissance revealed that fewer than 20 bombs had landed in the target area. It was not a good start for the $3 billion program. The commanders were veterans on the European theater. They were not yet aware of how different the B-29 was from the B-17. Nor were they aware of how difficult the Japanese targets, geography, and weather were compared to Germany's. Hap Arnold demanded better results. He wanted an attack on the Japanese homeland. On June 15th, Wolfe launched 92 B-29s from India. Of these, only 79 reached their Chinese staging bases. 78 were dispatched on a night raid against the steel mills of Yawata and Kyushu, Japan. Each plane carried 2 tons of bombs. The results were once again disappointing. Only 47 aircraft made it to Yawata. Only one bomb hit Yawata. It damaged a power station more than half a mile from the steel mill coke ovens. The Americans took comfort in the damage they must have caused to Japanese morale, but Arnold was not after Japanese morale. He was after their industry. The story of the next 6 months was much the same. And at home in the US, there was a myriad of B-29 production problems. Wolfe was sent back to sort them out. In September, the 20th Bomber Command was taken over by a firebrand from Europe. His name was Curtis LeMay. The dramatic acceleration of the Pacific War permitted a two-pronged strategy of attack. From bases in Chengsu, China, the 1,600-mile operating radius of the B-29 permitted it to hit targets from Manchuria through Japan all the way down to the tip of French Indochina. Superfortresses operating from Saipan and the Marianas could cover all the important targets in the heartland of Japan. Curtis LeMay's 20th Bomber Command was the first of 2 proms. To provide the second, the 21st Bomber Command was established in November 1944. It was to operate out of new airfields in the Marianas Islands. One of the United States Army Air Force's great planners, Possum Hansel, was made commanding officer of the 21st. Hansel landed his B-29 Jolt and Josie, the Pacific Pioneer, on Saipan on October 12, 1944. He was eager to validate in battle the many plans he participated in creating.
Well, the first element of the 21st Bomber Command has arrived. When we've done some more fighting, we'll do some more talking. Thank you.
Hansel felt the weight of his responsibility. He knew that even Curtis LeMay, in spite of his success in Europe, was having trouble turning things around against the Japanese and China. LeMay's problems with the 20th Command included difficulty of supply and the unreliability of the B-29's R-3350 engines. Occasionally, good bombing results were obtained. In April 1945, the assets of the 20th Bomber Command would be transferred to Tinian and Guam. By then, it had failed in its essential task of sustained bombing of Japan. So much had been expected of the B-29 that the American commanders were driven to prove that it was in fact an excellent weapon. At the very highest levels of command, where people were aware of the Manhattan Project, the urgency was even greater. Only the B-29 could carry the atomic bomb. If the Superfortress failed, the Manhattan Project became a complete waste. The pressure was felt and transmitted. But in the months after his arrival on Saipan with the 21st, Hansel was able to do no better than had previously been done in the 20th from China. The Committee of Operational Analysis had reconsidered the priorities in Japan. They now suggested that the aviation industry was the most important target. This had been the Air Force's choice all along. The Joint Chiefs of Staff directed that the principal aircraft engine manufacturers around Tokyo became the primary targets. The long series of attacks on Tokyo would be helped by the incredible bravery and skill of the crew of an F-13. The F-13 was the unarmed reconnaissance version of the Superfortress. Early in the morning of November 1st, 1944, Captain Ralph D. Stakely's F-13 became the first U.S. plane to fly over Tokyo since the Doolittle raid. These photos became the basis for all U.S. attacks on the city. Hansel's first strike on Tokyo was to be called San Antonio 1. After much training and many postponements, San Antonio 1 began at 6:15 a.m. on November 24th. The first plane to roll down Isley Field's runway was Dauntless Dottie, flown by Brigadier General Rosie O'Donnell. His co-pilot, Major Robert K. Morgan, had been a pilot on the famous B-17 Memphis Belle. Dauntless Dottie was followed by 110 more B-29s, carrying 278 tons of bombs. But the promising start to the mission unraveled. 17 aircraft aborted. Six more found themselves unable to bomb for mechanical reasons. The rest were caught up in a 120-knot wind. It was the infamous jet stream, then only just being recognized. They were swept over the target at a blistering 445 miles an hour. It was too fast for accurate bombing. But on the positive side, Japanese fighters' resistance was light. Flak was ineffective. Once again, reconnaissance photos showed the bombing results to be totally inadequate. Only 16 bombs had been observed to hit the target area. By now, the B-29 was performing fairly well. Extensive modifications had improved the reliability of its engines. But bombs were still not hitting the targets. The early Japanese analysis was that the costs of the B-29 were so great and its results so negligible that not even a wealthy nation like the United States could afford to persist the attacks. But unknown to all of the Japanese and most of the Americans, a change was in the wind. On December 18th, 1944, 84 B-29s of Curtis LeMay's 20th Bomber Command dropped 500 incendiary bombs in a daylight raid on Hankow, China. The attack destroyed the city as a major Japanese base. As a result of the success of LeMay's incendiary raid, Hansel's 21st Bomber Command was ordered to take a test raid on the city of Nagoya in Japan. It would be made by at least 100 B-29s, all dropping incendiary bombs. Hansel objected, saying that he wanted to continue precision bombing of the Japanese aircraft industry. In doing so, he put his career on the skids. You can buck the brass in the military, but only if you succeed. A test raid was run on Nagoya on January 3, 1945. 97 B-29s carried mostly incendiary bombs. It was not a good mission. Only 57 aircraft bombed the designated target. Damage on the ground was slight. The Japanese drew the conclusion that their fire prevention system was highly efficient. It was an erroneous and eventually disastrous assumption. Hansel reverted to his previous precision bombing tactics. He was unable to generate better results, apart from the one successful attack on the Kawasaki aircraft plant near Kobe. The one success didn't help Hansel. If you worked for Hab Arnold, you delivered or you were relieved. Hansel was relieved by Major General Curtis LeMay. Hansel's forte was planning. The time for planning was past. Now was the time for direct action, which was Curtis LeMay's strength. As a new commander, LeMay received more latitude than Hansel. He made 2 attacks using Hansel's method. Then he put 69 aircraft over Kobe to drop incendiary bombs. There was heavy fighter opposition. 2 B-29s were lost and 35 badly damaged. But the city of Kobe was hurt. More than 1,000 buildings were destroyed. In the latter part of the war, America's overwhelming advantage in numbers and quality usually allowed American forces to brush Japanese opposition aside. As the precision bombing efforts continued, further tests were made with incendiary bombs. In a heavy attack on Tokyo on February 25th, almost 30,000 buildings were destroyed, but the precision strikes against Japan continued to be ineffective. Enemy fighter opposition stiffened. In the series of attacks in February, 29 B-29s were lost to fighters, 10 were lost to flak. Almost as many were lost on the long overwater trip between Saipan and Japan. Another 21 crashed because of operational problems like engine fires, runaway propellers, or fuel exhaustion. And so far, the results were insignificant. The B-29, the multi-billion-dollar bomber, had failed in its intended role. But Curtis LeMay already had the remedy in mind. LeMay was aware that he was as vulnerable to have Arnold's impatience as any other man. He decided to try tactics he'd long considered and which had been carefully tested in the United States. It was the common opinion that Japanese cities were much more vulnerable to firebombing than those of Germany. And although Japanese industry was spread out into residential areas, it was still far more concentrated than its German counterpart. The B-29 had been designed from the start as a high-altitude bomber. In the European theater, it would have had to remain so. But conditions were different in Japan. Anti-aircraft guns and searchlights were not radar-controlled. It was reported that there were only 2 night fighter units in the homeland. Japanese airborne radar was primitive and not widely used. Without notifying General Arnold, LeMay decided to launch a series of maximum-effort, low-level incendiary night attacks against Japan. He was putting his career on the line. Night bombing offered many advantages. The winds were not so strong. The B-29's navigation system operated more efficiently, flying at lower altitude, easing the strain on the engines, lowering the fuel consumption, and leaving behind armament and ammunition permitted as a much bigger bomb load. About 12,000 pounds per plane. The concept of unarmed, low-level night bombing alarmed many of LeMay's staff. The word murder was quietly mentioned, but never to LeMay. The first raid was set for the night of March 9th. 334 B-29s carried almost 2,000 tons of bombs. The aircraft in the lead squadrons were to act as simple pathfinders. Their napalm bombs were intended to start major appliance fires, which would require the mobilization of all the Japanese firefighting equipment. The rest of the B-29s each carried 24 cluster units of M69 incendiary bombs. The M69 was designed by a high-level group of American scientists and engineers, some of whom were also involved in the Manhattan Project. Each M69 was only 20 inches long and 3 inches in diameter. It weighed just over 6 pounds. On crashing through the roof of its target, it was designed to detonate and spew out flaming gel as far as 30 yards. The gel stuck to whatever it hit, and it burned with hellish intensity. The technology of the M69 and the great logistics and support effort needed to deliver its target was an expression of the disparity between the American and Japanese war machines in 1945. The Japanese simply had no counter and no equivalent. On the evening of March 9th, it took almost 3 hours for LeMay's entire forces of B-29s to get airborne. The bombers would approach Tokyo individually at altitudes from 4,900 to 9,200 feet. Over Tokyo, the visibility was 10 miles or better. The napalm bombs of the Pathfinder aircraft started fires that were fanned by a brisk and rising wind. The initial attack hit a 12-mile square of the most densely populated part of the city. The fire spread rapidly and the results were devastating. The fire services were overwhelmed within 30 minutes of the attack. A firestorm swept the city. More than 1/4 of a million buildings were destroyed. More than 1/4 of the city's houses were gone. More than 1 million people were homeless. 83,000 dead. 160,000 injured. The Japanese were horror-stricken. There was no way to comprehend the disaster of this magnitude. It completely overrode the ideas of national superiority and the samurai spirit, and of the nation's place in the sun. On March 11th, the city of Nagoya became a target for incendiary attack. There was no firestorm, but 2 square miles of the city were destroyed. Osaka was attacked on March 13th. The city was blanketed by cloud cover and the B-29s were forced to use radar bombing. Unexpectedly, that gave more uniform results than visual bombing. Within 3 hours, more than 8 square miles of the city were totally destroyed. Morale in the B-29 units kept climbing. LeMay had found the magic formula. He made maximum use of the B-29 in tactics that took advantage of the enemy's weakness. These tactics converted the B-29 from a blunder to a war winner. LeMay was on a rampage. He drove his crews hard. They were already flying 60 hours a month. That was higher than the average of the 8th Air Force in Europe. But there was a shortage of replacements, and that shortage forced LeMay to increase monthly combat time to 80 hours. He had the scent of victory in his nostrils, victory over Japan, and victory over the concept of air power. LeMay knew that he had arrived at a point that General Coral Spotts and Bomber Harris had only dreamed of. He had the ultimate weapon at his disposal, and he knew that there was more to come. He believed that the maximum effort with his command could destroy Japan's ability to wage war. The strength of the 21st Bomber Command grew every day. By April, LeMay had more than 500 aircraft at his disposal. On May 11th, he launched a further attack on the 3 Japanese cities. His goal was to create such havoc that the terrible cost America had borne invading Okinawa would not be repeated in Japan. By June 15th, he had destroyed 112 square miles of Tokyo, Nagoya, Kobe, Osaka, Yokohama, and Kawasaki. His B-29s had now the benefit of long-range escort fighters, P-51s from Iwo Jima. LeMay had destroyed the 6 principal industry cities of Japan at a cost of 136 aircraft. The American loss rate, 1.9%, was acceptable, but the reality of it was still horrific. Japan was not able to stop this destruction. It lacked anti-aircraft guns, radar, and fighters to repel the invaders. It lacked fire engines, bomb shelters, and hospitals to help its citizens. Yet Japan was held captive by a martial spirit. That spirit had served the country ill on almost every battlefield in this war, but the government voted to fight on. LeMay and the 21st Bomber Command had brought Japan to its knees, but it would not surrender. The B-29's success in area bombing was a great relief to all those who had staked so much on its development. At the time, few people were aware of the Manhattan Project, and the essential role of the B-29 would have been in the successful delivery of an atomic weapon. By July 1941, a decision had been made to create an atomic bomb before the Germans did. The Manhattan Project eventually employed 120,000 people, including the country's top engineers and scientists. On July 16, 1945, an experimental bomb was detonated with results that were incredible even to those who had created it. Word of the successful test was immediately sent to the new president, Harry S. Truman. Truman, who was a novice, was plunged into the Potsdam Conference with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin. Truman mentioned to Stalin that a powerful new weapon had been tested. Stalin responded that he hoped it would be tested to good effect against the Japanese. Truman was pleased that Stalin did not press for more information. He was unaware that Stalin already knew what he needed to know from the Soviet spies at the center of the Manhattan Project. The Potsdam Declaration of July 26 indirectly warned the Japanese of the power of a new weapon. It stated that the only alternative to surrender was prompt and utter destruction. Japan was badly wounded by the B-29 raids. It was also cut off from food and industrial imports. Japanese leaders were fully aware that the war was lost, but as yet had not found a way to acknowledge it. A cultural phenomenon emerged unfamiliar to the West. It was mokusazu, a time-honored technique by which a Japanese officer would take refuge in a lofty silence when he did not agree with or did not understand an order. When the new Japanese Prime Minister Suzuki announced his response to the Potsdam Declaration, he used the term mokatsu. He meant to say, in essence, no comment. But his remarks were translated as meaning that Japan was contemptuously ignoring the declaration. It was a fatal error. In early 1944, plans for modifying 15 B-29s were formulated. The modifications were not extensive. The atomic bombs were being designed at the same time. The designs were adapted as much as possible to fit the B-29's bomb bay. The following summer, Arnold authorized the top-secret team of experts to create the first combat unit to use the new weapon. Colonel Paul W. Tibbets, Jr. was elected as commander of the new 509th Composite Group. The remainder of the group was handpicked to get the best possible people. For a long time, Tibbets was the only person in the 509th to know the true nature of the mission. The special facilities required for handling and loading the bomb were prepared in Tinian in the spring of 1945. By July, the 509th and its specially modified B-29s were in place. Further training began immediately with 6 specialized missions. Some of them involved harassment bombing of isolated garrisons on the islands of Truk and Marcus. After July 20th, the 509th crews executed 38 sorties, gaining experience in the precise tactics to be used when the atomic bomb was dropped. These sorties also made the sight of small formations of B-29 seem customary to the Japanese. A list of target cities was drawn up. They were the largest cities with the least damage remaining in Japan. Kyoto was removed because of its cultural significance and because of the negative reaction in Europe to the bombing of Dresden. Truman and Secretary Stimson felt the destruction of Kyoto might drive Japan into the Russian camp after the war. Hiroshima was now at the head of the line. Later, Nagasaki was added to the list. On Tinian, all necessary elements of the strike were prepared. Field Order No. 13 was signed on August 2, 1945 by Lieutenant General Nathan Twining. It directed the 509th Group to make a visual attack on Hiroshima. At one time, Hiroshima had been a busy naval port, but the port had been mined and the population was now reduced to under 250,000 people. There were many military installations. The entire economy was geared to the Japanese war effort. There were no Allied prisoner of war camps in the area. Seven aircraft were assigned to the mission. Leading the principal force was Tibbets and Enola Gay, named after his mother. Enola Gay was accompanied by 2 escort planes, crammed with cameras and observers to record the event. 3 aircraft were assigned duty as weather planes, 1 was designated as spare. On August 4th, the crews were told that the exact nature of the mission, and one of the bombs predicted 20,000 tons of TNT power, but even then they were not told it was an atomic bomb. At 2:45 in the morning of August 6, the Enola Gay took off. 5.5 hours later, Tibbets received word that the weather and visibility were good. At exactly 9:15, Enola Gay was flying at 328 miles an hour at 31,600 feet. Bombardier Major Thomas Farabee dropped the bomb. Tibbets then executed what later became known as the breakaway maneuver, a steeply banked 150-degree turn to avoid the expected blast by the time the bomb exploded 50 seconds later. The Enola Gay was 19 miles away. At detonation, there occurred the fireball, followed by the swiftly rising mass of smoke that turned into the notorious mushroom cloud. The cloud that still casts its symbolic shadow. President Truman immediately announced the event to the world. The news amazed every many members of the 509th Composite Group. the Japanese reaction was confused. Officially, they diminished the results of the attack. They said that it was only a new bomb which should not be made light of. Certainly not. 4.7 square miles of Hiroshima's center had been obliterated. More than 40,000 buildings were destroyed. Almost 80,000 people were killed. 171,000 were made homeless. LeMay's B-29s and the US Navy's carrier forces maintained pressure against Japan while the sole remaining atomic weapon in the world was prepared for use. The second and last atomic mission of the war began at 3:49 on August 9th. Major Sweeney and his crew flew boxcar. They traded their aircraft, the Great Artise, to Captain Frederick C. Bach. Sweeney's mission was as troublesome as Tibbet's mission had been trouble-free. The primary target was Kokura, but it was weathered in. Sweeney made 3 bomb runs. The bombardier couldn't see the target visually. Some Japanese fighters were in the area. Sweeney diverted to the secondary target, Nagasaki, which was also cloud-covered. Boxcar used radio for its run-in at the last minute. The bombardier, Captain Kermit Behan, saw the target at 10:58. He hit the bomb release. Most people were either at work or at home when the bomb detonated within 1 mile of the 2 huge Mitsubishi arms factories. Nagasaki's bowl-shaped terrain confined the effects of the bomb to a relatively small 1.45 square mile area. Approximately 35,000 people were killed. Incredibly, Emperor Hirohito's advisors on the Supreme Council for the direction of the war still debated whether or not to surrender. As Adolf Hitler had done, the military faction still wanted to resist in hope of obtaining better terms. On August 19th, the Japanese announced not their surrender, but their willingness to accept the Potsdam Declaration. In the days preceding the Japanese statement, routine B-29 missions had continued. On August 11th, they were suspended to give the negotiations a chance to mature. The United States responded to the August 10th Japanese statement by advising that from the moment of surrender, the authority of the Emperor and the Japanese government were subject to the Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers. When no word came back from the Japanese government, LeMay's B-29s were authorized to resume attacks. General Arnold had long waited his own Tokyo Millennium, 1,000 aircraft over Tokyo, while General Spaatz would have preferred to use such third atomic bomb if one had been available. LeMay was able to meet Arnold's wish. He put up a total of 828 bombers and 186 fighters over 1,000 aircraft in, all over Tokyo on August 14th. Before the last aircraft had landed, Japan had surrendered. The American forces continued to make a display of their air power over Japan. This reached the highlight September 2nd. 462 B-29s cruised over Tokyo Bay. All the surrender was signed aboard the USS Missouri. In the meantime, 900 B-29s had dropped almost 5,000 tons of supplies to more than 63,000 prisoners of war. Not only that, but camps in Japan, China, and Korea.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors, and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks' Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth, and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Superfortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the DroneScapes YouTube channel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.